That evening, as the house quieted down, a sense of stillness settled over me. It was a familiar silence, one that comes when everyone else has moved on to their own worlds. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing the last of the dishes, the warmth of the soapy water grounding me in the moment. My thoughts drifted as I moved mechanically until I noticed Alex, my teenage son, standing in the doorway, his curious eyes watching me. "What is it, Alex?" I asked, startled by the intensity of his gaze. "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. "Just, you looked like you were miles away." I smiled faintly. Just thinking. The house was unusually quiet that evening. My husband, James, was away on another work trip, a routine that had become so familiar it barely registered anymore. Alex had plans with his friends, leaving me to face the evening alone, a glass of wine my only companion. The weight of the silence pressed on me, and for a moment, I felt as if the walls of the house were closing in. "I'm heading out to Ryan's to study," Alex said, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. "Don't wait up for me." "Okay, honey." "Be safe," I replied, watching him leave. The sound of the door shutting echoed in the quiet, leaving me alone once again. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled onto the couch, the glow of the TV casting soft shadows in the room. Memories of earlier days with James surfaced, when his laughter filled the house, when weekends meant family breakfasts and spontaneous trips to the park. Those memories felt like faded photographs, distant and unreachable. Just as I started to lose myself in my thoughts, the front door creaked open. My heart leaped, startled by the sudden noise. "Mom?" Alex's voice rang out. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression uneasy. "Forgot my charger," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes as he grabbed it from the kitchen counter. "Do you need anything else?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "No, I'm good," he replied, pausing for a moment before heading back out. "Good night." "Good night, Alex," I said softly. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, though the brief encounter with Alex lingered in my mind. There was something in his demeanor I couldn't quite place, a flicker of concern or hesitation that stayed with me. It wasn't like him to be so withdrawn. The next morning, I moved about the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Alex came downstairs, his steps slow, his expression unreadable. "Morning," I greeted him, keeping my tone light. "Morning," he replied, sitting at the table and reaching for a glass of juice. The silence between us was thick, almost tangible. "Everything okay?" I asked, glancing at him as I flipped an omelet. "Yeah," he said quickly, though his body language told a different story. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me," I said gently, setting a plate in front of him. Alex hesitated, his eyes flicking up to meet mine. "It's nothing. Just a lot on my mind." I nodded, not wanting to push him but hoping he'd open up when he was ready. "Well, if you ever feel like talking, I'm here." "Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice soft. Later that evening, Alex joined me in the living room. "Want to watch a movie?" he asked, surprising me. "Sure," I said with a smile, patting the spot next to me on the couch. We chose an action film he'd been talking about for weeks. As we watched, the tension between us began to ease. We laughed at the over-the-top stunts and exchanged comments about the plot. For the first time in days, the atmosphere felt lighter, more familiar. When the movie ended, Alex turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks for tonight, Mom." "Anytime," I replied, feeling a warmth in my chest that had been missing for a while. As Alex headed upstairs, I sat back, reflecting on how much he had grown. He wasn't a little boy anymore, but the bond we shared was still there, unspoken but strong. The quiet moments we shared reminded me that, even in the midst of life's uncertainties, connection mattered most. And in that realization, the solitude I'd felt earlier began to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. My heart pounded in my chest as I considered the tension lingering in the air between Alex and me. I couldn't pinpoint when the distance between us had shifted, but now it felt as though unspoken words hung heavy, threatening to spill out at any moment. He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the floor as though he were grappling with something too large to put into words. "It's just I don't know how to say this without it sounding strange, he admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. You can say anything to me, I assured him gently. My voice carried more confidence than I felt, a desperate attempt to bridge the widening gap. Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair in a familiar gesture of frustration. It's about that night, he said finally, the words slipping out as though they had been pressing against him for days. My heart stuttered. I wasn't prepared for this. What about it? I asked cautiously, feeling the edges of the conversation tighten around us. I've been thinking about it a lot, he admitted, his tone quiet but resolute. Not in a bad way, but in a way that's confusing. It made me see things differently. His words sent a ripple through the air. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak. This wasn't just a fleeting confession, it was something deeper, something that demanded to be acknowledged. Alex, I began, my voice steady but soft. Sometimes moments like that can make us question things. But it's important to focus on what's real, on what grounds us. He nodded, but his gaze remained distant. I know. It's just hard to sort through it all. The vulnerability in his voice tugged at me. You don't have to figure it all out right now, I said. Sometimes, clarity comes with time. The weight of the conversation lingered between us as Alex stood, his movements hesitant. I think I need some air, he said abruptly, grabbing his jacket and heading toward the door. I watched him leave, my emotions swirling. There was no denying that something had shifted, but I also knew that dwelling on it wouldn't help either of us. I needed to focus on maintaining the bond we had without letting these feelings complicate things further. Later that evening, the sound of the front door opening startled me. I turned to see Alex step inside, his expression unreadable. Hey, I greeted him cautiously, setting down the book I'd been pretending to read. Hey, he replied, his voice softer now. He lingered near the door before finally making his way to the couch. How was your walk? I asked, trying to keep the tone light. He shrugged. Cleared my head a bit, he said, though the way he avoided my gaze suggested otherwise. The silence between us stretched, and I felt an ache to bridge the gap. Alex, I started, choosing my words carefully. Sometimes the hardest part is being honest with yourself. But it's okay to not have all the answers right away. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. Thanks, Mom, he said quietly, his tone carrying a mixture of gratitude and something unspoken. The rest of the evening passed with a quiet sort of companionship. We watched a movie together, the tension easing slightly as laughter and shared commentary broke through the unease. By the time the credits rolled, the heaviness that had been weighing on us seemed lighter. As Alex headed upstairs to bed, I sat alone on the couch, reflecting on the evening. The road ahead wasn't clear, but I felt a renewed sense of hope that, with time and patience, we could navigate whatever lay ahead. The weight of the moment hung in the air between us. Alex's expression was a mixture of confusion, frustration, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. His words lingered, but I knew I had to respond carefully to keep the balance of our relationship intact. Alex, I began, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. We need to talk about this, really talk about it. He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the floor before meeting mine. I don't want things to feel weird between us, he admitted, his tone softer now. It's just, I don't know how to handle all of this. Neither do I said, taking a deep breath. But we'll figure it out together. That's what matters. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly at my words. He gave a small nod, and for a moment, it felt like the bridge between us was being rebuilt. I gestured for him to sit down, and we moved to the kitchen table, the neutral space somehow making the conversation feel more manageable. Let's start from the beginning, I said, folding my hands on the table. Tell me what's been on your mind. Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's hard to explain. It's like, I've been stuck, and then suddenly everything shifted. And now I'm trying to make sense of it all. I nodded, encouraging him to continue. It's okay to feel that way, I said gently. Change can be overwhelming, but it's also a chance to grow. He looked at me, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Do you ever feel like you're not the person you used to be? Like you're just drifting? The question caught me off guard. I paused, thinking carefully before answering. Yes, I admitted. I think everyone feels that way at some point. But what matters is how you use those feelings to move forward. Alex nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I guess I just don't know where to start. Start small, I suggested. Focus on the things that make you happy, the things that matter most to you. And remember, you don't have to have it all figured out right away. He gave a faint smile, and the tension in the room began to dissipate. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, his classes, his friends, and a funny story about his dog, and for the first time in days, I felt like we were finding our way back to a sense of normalcy. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, Alex joined me in the kitchen. Need any help? He asked, his tone casual. Sure, I said, handing him a cutting board and a knife. You can chop the vegetables. We worked side by side, the rhythm of the task creating a comfortable silence. Occasionally, we exchanged small comments and jokes, and the atmosphere grew lighter with each passing moment. By the time the meal was ready, it felt like the weight of the past few days had finally lifted. Over dinner, we talked about his plans for the future, what he wanted to study, where he saw himself in 5 years. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself smiling more than I had in weeks. It was a reminder of how much potential he had, how much he was still discovering about himself. As the evening drew to a close, Alex turned to me, his expression serious once again. Thanks for tonight, he said. For listening, and for just being here. I reached out, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. Always, I said. That's what family is for. He smiled, and in that moment, I felt a sense of hope that we could navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but we were stronger together. That night, as I sat on the couch with a book in hand, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The conversations we had weren't just about resolving the tension between us, they were about building a foundation of trust and understanding. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were moving in the right direction.